Scoping is very important for you to understand. Now, this lecture will cover a few anomalies in the JavaScript scoping. But before we do that, we actually have to understand what do I mean by scope or scoping. To understand this, think of yourself in a large building. So let's say you're working for a large company, and that company has a big building and it's got many rooms in that building. Now, somebody asks you to fetch a box from the storeroom, and you go to that room, but you'll notice there's a lock on the door and you don't have the code. Well, this is everything to do with scoping. I want you to, whenever you hear the word scoping, think of the word access. You can go back to that individual and say, that box is out of my scope. It's out of my access level. I don't have clearance to go put the code in because I don't know the code and I can't fetch that box. It's out of my scope. Now let's say there are many boxes in the reception area and it has a big sign, pick one. Well, those boxes are globally accessible. They're accessible to the public. Any Joe Public member can walk into the reception area and pick one of these boxes up. That's in the global scope. It's accessible to everybody. But that box that was behind a locked door, well, unfortunately, that is out of our scope. So this is what scoping means. It just simply means access. So hopefully that's cleared up a lot about scoping, and that's exactly what I mean. When you think about scope, just think about, is this particular variable or function or whatever it is that you are calling, because don't forget you can call functions and you can call variables, and what you need to do is think, can I access it here? So let's start out with the basics. Let's start out with the global scope. So I'm going to create a variable and let's give it the name of hello. And this is going to return the string global. Now what you are doing here is you are creating a key directly on the window object. So if we take a look at this and I scroll right down, you'll notice it's created a key right on the window object, and that key contains the string global. Now, this key is accessible to everybody. So this is in fact a global variable. It's in the global scope because it's directly attached to the window object. So if I scroll back up again, let's now take a look at an object, because objects also have their own scopes. So wherever you see these opening and closing brackets, you need to think, that's a scope there. Because what you can do is now have more keys. So I can say inner, and then I can have an object. So there's another scope. And this scope can have, let's say, two properties. Code is 1, 2, 3, 4. And also I can have another property which says inner context. And in fact, you could just have inner as well, because don't forget it has its own scope. And this scope, this inner, won't conflict with this scope because they're in separate scopes. So I have inner, and then I can have another object, and then I can finally say finish. This is another key in another scope, and it can return the string fini. That's it. If I hit return, I've now created not one scope, but two, but not two, three. I've created three scopes right there. So first of all, we have the global scope, which is accessible by the keyword hello. So if I type in hello, it will return that scope, and it will return everything in that scope. But if I want to extract a specific value, then I'm going to need the right combination. So now I want to access this inner scope. So I need to say .inner. I need the right combination here. And then once I'm in this inner scope, I can then take a look at, let's say, pulling out the code property, like so. But I could also go one scope further. I can say .inner, and now I'm going to this scope. But you'll notice it doesn't conflict. If I run this, it doesn't conflict. This inner key doesn't conflict with this inner key because they're in different scopes. This is one scope. This is the other scope in the inner property. And then we also have another inner property within this scope, doesn't affect any other scope, and that contains another scope. We have finally the last key, which is finish. I could have another key in here called inner, and again, it would not conflict, but I can just say, grab that key. So you can see that objects have their own scopes, and you have a whole hierarchy of scopes, and you need to get the correct key combination in order for you to access the value that you want. So we go from the global scope into an inner scope, into an inner scope, and then we finally call a property within that last scope, which is finish. Nice and easy. Now also, functions have scopes as well. So let's take a look at this. If I create a function, and let's give it the name of test, and we are going to create a variable inside of the function's execution context. So a function's execution context has its own scope. So I'm creating this variable within this scope, within this room. So I'm going to give this variable a name. I'll call it Loz, and it equals Lawrence. And we can tell the function to grab that box and tip it upside down and produce that value when this function is called. So I say return whatever is inside of that box or variable. So I'll say return Loz. Now if I call test, notice what happens. What it did was it created a box, a variable, it gave it a value, and then we said, right, when you are called, go ahead and return a value that is within that variable, within that box. Go grab that box. So it looked inside of this room. It didn't go to the global scope. It didn't go to the reception area. What it first did was it looked inside of this scope, and then it went, aha. Okay, we've found it, no problem. And return the value, which it did. Now, did it create a global variable? In other words, did it create this Loz variable on the window object? The answer is no, because it's inside of this scope. It's within a room within the building. It's not in the reception area where everybody can gain access to it. So if you were to actually scan through the window object, you would not find Loz. And the easiest way to find that out is just to type in Loz, which means you have a fetch command right here. And so if you just have a name on its own like this, not in quotation marks, it's not a string. If you just have the name, a key name on its own, JavaScript will automatically try to fetch that box. So we're trying to fetch this box now, not within a function. Within a function it worked because that variable was in that room. It was within that scope. But it's not within the window scope, the global scope. So we'll try to look at that window object and it won't be able to find the Loz variable because we created that box and gave it a value. And then once the execution context had finished, it simply deleted the box. This box is no longer in memory. The value was returned and that's it. The box got thrown away, got chucked into an incinerator. And so no other function can access the variable Loz within our program. And also we can't access the Loz variable in the global scope. Why? Because it's in the function's scope. It's within a locked room and we don't have the code. So this is an important case of why you need to understand scoping. Now let's also reverse the process. Let's take a look at creating a global variable. So I can say var globe. So I'm creating a variable on the global scope, on the window object, and I'm going to give it the value of global scope. There's the string value. And we can call this directly. No problem. Now what about my function? So I can create the function again, and again, just give it the name of test. So I can just rewrite over this function. That's not a problem. So what JavaScript will do is delete the old function test and replace it with this function. And what I can do now is say return the value of the globe variable. Now I didn't create this variable within this function's scope. This variable is on the global scope. So it's available to the Joe public and to private members. So it's available anywhere. And therefore, when I call test, boom, what it did was it said go ahead, and we're only providing the name of the variable, so that's a fetch command. So we've asked it to fetch a variable called globe. We've asked it to say, look, go fetch me a box, it's called globe. And what JavaScript did was firstly took a look at this scope. It had a look around the room that it was in, and it said the globe box isn't here. So it went down to the reception area where everybody has access, and it said, aha, there's the box called globe. It's available to anybody. It's on the window object. It's in the global scope. So we know that we have a global variable called globe, and it returns the string global scope. But what happens when, let's say, I create a function? So I'm going to rewrite my test function again, and I'm going to create a variable within the function's execution context, within its scope, and I'm going to call it globe. And I'm going to give it a value. And I'm going to say inner test. So it's got a different string. And so we know which variable is going to be called. Which do you think is going to be returned when we say go fetch globe? Also, is there going to be an error? Let's find out. So I'm going to now invoke this execution's context, which will create a variable called globe. We didn't get an error. What we got was the inner test. Now this is why I stress the importance of JavaScript first looking around the room that it's in. It's looking at the scope that it's in currently. So when you run this function, you're going into this room, you're entering that room. And what we're saying here is, could you go fetch me the globe box and just give me the value out of that box? And what JavaScript did was it first looked around the room. That's what you'd naturally do as a human being. You'd look around the room for that box. You wouldn't just go straight down to the reception area and try to find the box. What you're going to do is look around the room, and it found the box in the room. It found this variable, globe. And so what it did was it said, aha, I've got this. It tipped the box up and it said, hey, I'm going to return what's in that box. And it gave us the string inner test. There wasn't an error. But did it affect this box that's on the window object? Let's find out. No. Globe still has the value of global scope. This box is temporary. So this box is in the lobby. This is in the reception area. Even though it has the same name, they're not in the same scope. So there's no conflict there. So this box is sitting down in the reception area. Now when I invoked this function, I went into this room, and there's a guy in that room, and he said, look, go fetch me a box called globe. And what I did was I quickly spun around the room. I found a box that has that name within this room, and I returned the value. Then, don't forget, that variable, after the function is finished executing, goes into the bin. All right, I don't need that box anymore, chuck it in the bin. So I thought I'd throw it away. And that's exactly what's happened here. So it first looks inside of the scope, and if you have different scopes, so we're in this room, this box isn't going to affect the box in the reception area. So now hopefully you can understand the importance of scoping. Now on top of that, what if I wanted to run a function and that function was to create a global variable? At the moment, we're only creating local variables or local to that room in that scope. So how do we say, right, well, I'm in this room, but what I want you to do is go down to the reception area, create a box, give it a name, and put a value in there. How do we do that? So let's create our room again called test. And this room has its own scope. Now, I'm not going to type in the var keyword. I'm going to get rid of the var keyword. The var keyword says to the JavaScript compiler, create a box within this room, create a variable within this scope. We don't want to do that anymore. We do not want to respect the scope. We want to go out of the scope and create a variable on the global scope. and I'm going to call this variable hello4. Now, if I just leave it like this, it won't create the variable. What it will do is you are issuing a fetch command. And so what it will first do is look around the room for that box, and then it'll go to the global scope. And again, this variable hasn't been created. So if I type in hello4, ultimately, if I run the function, you get an error because it'll look on the global scope and it won't find it. So I'm going to say hello4 equals. Now you've changed it from a fetch command, just the name on its own, to a create command. And then I'm going to give it a value, and I'm going to say inf global. Inf stands for inferred global. That's what we're inferring by this. We have not got the var keyword, so it won't respect the scope. We're no longer saying create this hello4 box within this room. If you get rid of R, you're saying create this hello4 box, this variable on the global scope. Go create that box in the reception area. So that's why it's very important to include the var keyword if you want to create a variable within the scope. But if you want to create a variable or set a value of a global variable, then you do not put the var keyword in there. So now I'm saying hello4 equals, so what you're going to do is either create or assign a value to this global variable. In our case, we're creating this global variable and giving it a value. Let's hit return. Now, if I was to type in hello4, I'd still get an error. Why? Because I haven't run the function yet. So this variable hasn't been created. Let's run the function, and then let's say hello4. Now you'll notice it's created a variable, a global variable. This hello4 property has been created on the window object, and it contains the value of inf global. Again, this is called an inferred global. It means you're inferring to the JavaScript compiler that you want to create this variable on the global scope. So it's called an inferred global. And that's exactly what we've done. So we're no longer respecting the scope by purely taking out the var keyword. But you must be very careful, because just by missing off that var keyword, you could end up creating unnecessarily a global variable. And that's called clobbering the global scope, unnecessarily adding a property onto the window object or method onto the window object. And so that is bad. We don't want to do that. But in some circumstances, you will want to either create a global variable or change its value. So what I can do is go ahead and clear the console, and let's go ahead and create a function. And what we want to do is right here, we're saying go fetch this box, and we want to change its value. You're either going to fetch or create. So if it doesn't exist, create the box. And as you know, we're creating a global variable. But in this instance, the box already exists, hello4. So I'm just going to say changed. So now we're changing the value of a pre-existing global variable. And so if I go ahead and hit return, if I call hello4 now, it will still say inf global. The reason being is because we must call the function. And what you're telling the JIT compiler is go fetch that box, and I want you to take whatever is inside of that box, and I want you to delete whatever is inside of it and replace it with the value I've given you. Now, what it will do again is first of all look around this function first and foremost. So it's going to look around for the box hello4 within this room. It won't find it, and then what it'll do is it'll go out into the window object, into the global scope. And again, it will either find or create that variable, which in this case it will find it, and then it will delete whatever is inside of that box, which is inf global, and change it out for the string changed. And so now that I've ran this function, let's type in hello4, and you'll notice we get the value of changed. So that's exactly what it did. It looked around the room, then it went to the global scope, and then it replaced the value that was in that box for a different value. So whenever you think about creating variables and functions or accessing variables and functions, you need to think, is it within the scope? Can I access this variable or function when I call it right here? Is it accessible? Or where am I creating this variable or function? Am I creating this function on the global scope, or am I creating this function inside of an object, a method? So scoping is very important.